Thank you, Lisa.
One last thing I forgot. This is, just for those to know, this is being recorded and will be shared with the public afterwards. So thank you. Okay, there we go.
Thank you, Lisa. And good evening, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our series on policing in communities of color. Tonight's session, we are joined by the Director of Training and Education for the National Association of Civil Oversight and Law Enforcement, Camme McEllhiney, and also the, I lost my place here, and also Liana Perez, who's the Director of Operations. Tonight's meeting, as I said, is the second part in our series. We are hoping that this is going to spark some community dialogue and discussion about possible recommendations to our City Council, and also to spark further dialogue and discussions within the citizenry of the city of what is responsible policing and what does our city need in terms of protection, but also security for people who may not necessarily recognize the measures, use of force that sometimes employed. And, you know, it's kind of a confusing times for a lot of folks here. So with that said, I want to turn this over to our Vice President, Councilperson Lisa Berkeley. So Lisa.
All right, thank you. Before we begin, I realized there are two things that, and this is life doing life's things. We were going to be having both simultaneous translations in Spanish and also sign language. And unfortunately, one of them got very sick and then the other one had a family emergency. So I'm very sorry if you were anticipating that. If that is something you are looking for, please follow up with an email with us and we will be sure to get you the necessary interpretation as a follow-up or do whatever we can to accommodate your needs. And with that, I am going to, I don't know, Camme and Liana, how you like to begin, but you are it. The floor is yours.
We're on. Okay.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm just going to share my screen here for a moment.
Be sure that that's easy. Okay, hold on. Okay. There you go.
Okay. Well, first, I want to start by saying thank you for having us here today. My name is Camme McEllhiney, and as David mentioned earlier, I am the Director of Training and Education for the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, or NACOL for short. We are very glad to be here today. What NACOL does throughout the year is provide training, resource, support for those looking to establish oversight and those who already have oversight in their cities or jurisdictions. We do that through annual conference, through webinars, regional meetings, and then also, even more so in the last couple of days. Sorry, hold on just a moment. This seems to be moving on its own. Oh goodness. So,
okay.
Hold on just a moment. Bear with me for a moment. Technical difficulties.
Welcome to technology. It's all
right, right. Okay. So, and we do those trainings throughout the year. And in the last several weeks, we have been doing even more communication with cities like yourself, who are looking to find more information about civilian oversight. So before we jump into kind of our Civilian Oversight 101 conversation here, Liana and I just want to tell you a little bit about ourselves and how we came to be involved in civilian oversight of law enforcement. In 1998, I was appointed to a civilian review board here. I'm actually talking to you today from Indianapolis, Indiana. And I was appointed to a review board here. We oversaw complaints that were filed against members of the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department. I served on that board for 6 years and started out on the board not just being an involved community member and not really knowing very much about civilian oversight, not knowing a tremendous amount about police policies, and quickly learned that there was a need for training for that. So that's kind of what started this long journey that brings me to you here today. I also was fortunate to have an executive director at that time who was one of the founders of our organization. And he brought me in. I had started volunteering for the organization, and then eventually became the director of training education about 5 years ago. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of our discussion today, I'm going to turn it over to Liana to introduce herself while I try to fix
the runaway screen.
The runaway screen.
So are you, if you're in your slideshow setting, you should be able to have a pause button that's up at the top.
Yes. Yes. Let me go here.
So while she's doing that, I can go ahead and introduce myself. So I'm Liana Perez. I'm speaking to you from Tucson, Arizona. So I'm on the same time as you are. I know Camme's staying up late with us tonight, but very happy to be here. I came to be involved in oversight back in 1997. I was working for the city of Tucson, the Office of Equal Opportunity Programs, doing civil rights work with respect to investigating EEO complaints, discrimination complaints in housing, and so forth. And the city of Tucson created this position as a result of a lot of community advocacy work that was going on at the time to have our elected officials look at what type of a model the city of Tucson could create with respect to oversight. So at that time, the city decided to create kind of a hybrid, what we call now a hybrid model, basically a police auditor with a police advisory review board as part of the oversight entity. So in '97, I became the auditor. I did that till 2014 when I retired. And I retired to go and do some work with NACOL because NACOL supported me and mentored me throughout my profession in all those years. And I felt I needed to give back a bit. And then in 2016, I was kind of called out of retirement back to the city of Tucson for a couple of years. And now I'm doing full-time work for NACOL.
So thank you, Liana. So I will jump in here. The first couple of things that we're going to talk about today are civilian oversight of law enforcement, what defines it, what guides it. We're also going to talk about a few facts about the field of civilian oversight, and Liana will close us out today with talking about the specific models of oversight that exist. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about civilian oversight, and I think that I always show this slide as a starting point when we do our presentations. I think it's even more appropriate in this moment. You know, civilian oversight is a very important part in helping to move along a process in a system that needs a lot of reform. But I think it's important to remember that civilian oversight alone cannot fix the problem, but it will be nearly impossible to do it without it. So I like to kind of start at that point, because a lot of times, particularly when there is an incident in a city that creates outcry from the community, one of the first things that gets said is we need civilian oversight. And if we just have a civilian oversight board and we have subpoena power, that those two always seem to go together in the outcry, that everything will be okay. And you definitely need civilian oversight, but there's also a lot of other things that need to be put into place as well. And so I want you to know that today we're talking about a piece of a solution. So civilian oversight can be defined in several different ways. In its most basic form, We're talking about something that an agency that investigates, audits, or reviews internal law enforcement investigations, maybe processes community complaints, or looks at use of force incidents. It also can conduct ongoing monitoring of law enforcement, which can include looking at an agency's policy, the way it trains its officers, how it manages its officers, and the supervision practices. And it's important to remember that these two first bullet points are things that are conducted by those who are not sworn law enforcement. That's that key civilian piece of that. So evolution of oversight. Oversight traditionally, I mean, our first oversight entity that we see in the United States in any tangible form was in the 1920s in Los Angeles. It didn't last long. It didn't have any authority. It wasn't put into existence through ordinance or any kind of city mandate. But it did at least get the ball rolling for what we now call the modern era of civilian oversight. But through most of its history, it has been a very reactive process, not only in its creation. It's often created after a high profile incident or scandal, but even in its actions and how it conducts business. It often responds to primarily individual complaints. So someone makes a complaint, and then the oversight agency comes in and does something, whether it's investigation or moving it on to whatever agency needs to handle it. It usually reviews policies after complaints have been made, when it sees a trend. It emphasizes legalistic rules. The administrative process can often be seen as adversarial, even if unintentional. Sometimes it can be seen that way. And it has recommended sanctions for individual officers. That's not always within the purview of an oversight agency, but that has been one of the reactive measures. However, things are starting to change a little bit. In the last, I would say, decade in particular, civilian oversight is now including proactive elements. And even so, more so than we've seen recently, we've seen the proactive establishment of oversight. So in cities, and I, from talking to people prior to this conversation this evening, it seems like there is a pretty good situation in Marina. And, but what we're seeing is that cities are looking at the situation they have and wanting it to be better, and to definitely not have that incident that pushes you into community in complete crisis. So we are seeing and talking to more, particularly in the last 13 days, I'm sure Liana could give more information about that later, but about cities that are looking to establish it before that critical incident. But even in the work that existing oversight agencies are doing, they're much more proactive in their work. They are doing investigation, collection of data, and analysis of that data in a proactive manner. They're also identifying underlying issues and causes of problems. They focus on organizational change. So how can we make our organization better so that we don't have problems in the future? Concentrates on the reduction or prevention of misconduct rather than dealing with misconduct after it happens. And it also works on building partnerships with law enforcement agencies. One of the things, and we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go on this evening, is that one of the benefits of civilian oversight is it does provide this bridge, if you will, between community and law enforcement to help bring more transparency and accountability to a process that often is seen as hidden from community eyes. And also, lastly, it promotes a front-end accountability. How can we be accountable and make ourselves a better organization before something bad happens? So a few facts about the field. There are currently about 166 active civilian oversight entities across the United States. And when I say when I'm talking about civilian oversight entities, I'm talking about ones that have been put into existence through ordinance. Maybe they're part of the city charter, through voter referendum. I'm not talking about community advisory boards that are kind of brought together just to be in an advisory capacity. These are agencies who actually have a mandate through law. Something that's really important to note is that no two entities in the United States are exactly the same. There are a lot that are very similar, particularly when you're talking about civilian oversight boards. A lot of them have the same basic structure, but civilian oversight is very, very special in that it really is molded to the needs of the community in every community in which it exists. So a lot of times when we are working with communities who are looking to establish it, we advise them to go out to the stakeholders and find out what's needed, what would work best in their situation, and that tweaks it just enough so that it's different from the one that might be next door. So traditionally, and actually at this point in time, most large cities and large law enforcement agencies have civilian oversight. But in addition to the LAs and the New Yorks and the Chicagos, there are a lot of mid and particularly small cities who are looking to civilian oversight. So not only do we have Indianapolis and St. Louis, but we also have, Athens, Georgia, and Charlottesville, and cities such as yours that are smaller that are looking at establishing some form of civilian oversight. And as I mentioned before, it often begins as a reaction to a specific incident. But something we're also seeing that really is a fairly new phenomena in the history of civilian oversight is that it began to be more prominently featured in the Department of Justice settlement agreements. So in cities such as New Orleans, Seattle, civilian oversight figured prominently in their methods for reforming police departments. So it became much more of a regimented process, if you will. So why is oversight necessary? And I feel like I feel like I have to say all of these things, I feel like everyone I'm talking to today probably knows this list. So it protects human rights, it promotes constitutional policing, it increases public confidence and trust in the police, it builds bridges, as I mentioned before, between law enforcement and the police, and it supports effective policing. So I want to stop on this one for just a second. One of the things that I think that particularly law enforcement doesn't always see as a benefit or why oversight is necessary is because when the community has a better relationship with law enforcement and vice versa, law enforcement becomes easier. They're working with a community that trusts them, making for a safer work environment, one where they can go into a community and instead of being met with brick walls because there might not be that trust, it works to help build the trust so that policing can become more effective in those communities. It ensures greater accountability and it enhances risk management. And we'll talk a little bit more about that last one in a bit. So some common goals of oversight. So first, to ensure that the police complaint process is accessible to all and that there are few, if any, barriers to filing complaints. So this is what you want if you're going to establish oversight. These are some things that you need to strive for. So when I'm talking about fewer barriers, you need to be able to file a complaint no matter, if you can't go to an office. You don't want to put an oversight office necessarily in the middle of a police department because that seems someone who's trying to file a misconduct complaint might not feel comfortable filing that complaint in that environment. Many cities have moved to accept anonymous complaints for those who might be concerned about retribution. And that also some cities have apps for both Androids and iPhones so that people can send complaints almost immediately and with little effort if they need to. Next, another goal is to ensure that investigations are fair and thorough. Being fair in civilian oversight helps build legitimacy, and that is very important to effective and sustainable oversight. If either side of the coin, law enforcement or community, feel that the process isn't fair, then they won't trust the process, and you really won't be able to carry out your mandate for many reasons. Another goal is to improve public confidence in the police, to enhance transparency, and also by holding officers accountable. It also is improve the policies and practices, also training of law enforcement agencies by analyzing patterns in the complaints and other police-related data. And then also back to that reactionary slides we had before, it does deter officers from engaging misconduct through the creation of more effective and consistent investigation and disciplinary processes. Now, I will say that, you know, in dealing with human beings, civilian oversight does not completely wipe out misconduct. What it does do is make sure that when misconduct does occur, that the investigations are thorough and fair, that there is a consistent and fair disciplinary process, and that in certain cases, when it is a civilian oversight agency that's able to analyze data, that they also put things in place so misconduct is less likely to occur in the future. And then it also, one of the common goals is to reduce legal liability associated with officer misconduct. So there have been a few studies that link civilian oversight to fewer lawsuits and payouts by cities. There is a professor out of Northwestern who actually also used to be the director of the Chicago Police Board, who did some research in this area. And so I'm happy to point you in the direction of that if any of you are interested in reading more about that particular piece. And also another goal is to improve the public's understanding of police policy. I think that any oversight agency would agree that a lot of the complaints that they get of misconduct stem from a misunderstanding. I mean, I mentioned it at the very beginning when I was introducing myself. Very few citizens know what police policy is in their city. They don't necessarily know all of the use of force policies or what is the process when you get pulled over by the police. And I think on the other side of that, there's also a place in there for kind of know your rights training so that you also understand where your rights stand in the process of police policy. But I think that understanding police policy is also a common goal, and why mediation has become such an important piece of so many oversight agencies throughout the country, so that they can resolve misconduct complaints in many instances through mediation, so that people can understand where each side is coming from a little bit better. So before I hand it over to Liana, I wanted to talk a little bit about the 13 principles for effective oversight. So these are one of the most important pieces that we like to teach people, particularly those who are thinking about establishing civilian oversight, because I think you all will remember that I said early on that a lot of cities say, hey, if we just have this civilian review board and we have subpoena power or this, then everything will be fine. Well, effective civilian oversight, effective sustainable civilian oversight is what you're looking for, so that you can make sure that what you're putting in place can actually carry out its mandates and make a difference in your community. So I just wanted to talk briefly about these 13 principles before we move on. So the first one is independence, and the absence of real or perceived influence from law enforcement, political actors, or other special interest groups is incredibly important when conducting civilian oversight. If you aren't seen as, if you do not have an independence, or you are not perceived as being independent, then it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to maintain legitimacy in the eyes of the public or of law enforcement. Next, we have clearly defined and adequate jurisdictional authority. So having adequate authority is fundamental to achieving organizational goals and ensuring the oversight agency can actually be responsive to the communities. It has to have enough authority to successfully perform its duties to the greatest degree possible and without any limitation. Next, we have unfettered access to records and facilities. So in the course of doing the work, a civilian oversight needs to be able to review all the records relevant to an investigation or other matters within its purview. And it needs to be able to do it in a timely manner. So what I'm talking about here is, there are some agencies out there that have a difficult time obtaining records that they need to actually do the job that they've been mandated to do. And so it's very important that there are things put into place that allow people access to the information that they need to do their job. And then in the case of those that do jail and prison oversight, it's also important that they have unfettered access to the facilities so that they can carry out their mandates. Next, we have access to law enforcement executives and internal affairs staff. So the effectiveness of a civilian oversight agency's ability to, or the effectiveness of the agency can hinge on their ability to communicate with law enforcement officials regarding the matters that they identify throughout the course of their work. They need to have a good working relationship with both law enforcement executives and internal affairs staffs that doesn't cross that line of, I'm sure you can all imagine it, it's very important that oversight is seen not to side with one side or the other. Often we say that if oversight is doing its job, someone is always upset with them. But you can be upset with people and still respect them. But because you need that access, it is also important to think about that the legislation establishing the oversight should require that law enforcement agencies provide timely written responses to civilian oversight. So for instance, with the Civilian Oversight Board, perhaps they don't agree with the findings of an investigation that Internal Affairs did. In many cases, that Civilian Review Board would then go to the chief and say, we don't agree and we would like to discuss with you changing the disposition of this investigation in misconduct. And so what you want is to make sure that there are time frames that the chief has to respond to that and has to, whether they agree or disagree, that is in writing so that there is a record of that, and that so that the public can know, because the chief may be absolutely right in their decision, but the public, without information as to why the chief didn't agree, might not ever understand that reasoning. So it's important that that also is there in the legislation. Even if you have a very good cooperative law enforcement agency today, it's important to have those things in place, because who knows what 5 years from now will look like. Also, full cooperation. So full cooperation of all of the officers and department staff is needed for an oversight agency to do their work. They can't do the work if they've got walls being put up at every corner. So it is important, and a lot of times civilian oversight entities look for cooperation with civilian oversight entities to be a condition of employment, if that is legally a viable option for you in your state. So the next one, sustained stakeholder support. So while establishing civilian oversight may be very politically expedient in a time of crisis, successful oversight and effective oversight requires that same kind of support throughout its lifetime. Without it, it is very difficult to maintain independence, achieve accountability, or see any kind of transparency. So it's very important to continue to have relationships with the stakeholders so that that can happen. And we'll talk a little bit more about that with principles 10 and 11. Next, we have adequate funding and operational resources. This one is fairly self-explanatory. If you want a civilian oversight to succeed, you need to fund it to the extent that it can actually carry out its mandate. There are a tremendous amount of civilian oversight agencies throughout the country right now who, when they were formed, they might not have enough staff. They might not be able to have the type of budget where they can maintain their good staff members because they can't pay them well enough. Or they don't have enough money to actually train not only their staff, but also their volunteer boards, because it's so important for people to understand not only law enforcement policies and practices, but also civilian oversight practices. It's incredibly important to the success of any oversight agency. Number 8, we have public reporting and transparency. So many agencies, almost all agencies, are required to at least do an annual report. It is essential, it's an essential component to build that piece where transparency can kind of plant its seed there. Without that transparency, the community has no idea what's going on, not only with law enforcement, but also with the civilian oversight entity as well. And I should add here that one of the tenets of civilian oversight that we talk about, it's not on these 13 lists, but it goes without saying, and with most of our agencies, is that there's the same transparency, accountability, and independence kind of piece that we want to hold civilian oversight entities to, that we want to hold law enforcement agencies to as well. So those reports can also help the community know what the civilian oversight entity is doing. In addition to annual reports, there are some who do semi-annual, and there are those that are mandated with special reports. For instance, those agencies that monitor protests, like the DC Office of Police Complaints. They have done special reports on effective practices in monitoring protests, and then also doing reporting on what they're seeing when they're doing that monitoring, which helps give more information to the public. Next, I'll just kind of combine community outreach and community involvement, which I think probably to many seem like they're the same thing. However, community outreach is going out into the community. It's a way to connect with and build relationships with stakeholders, recruit volunteers, solicit community input and involvement, and facilitate learning about the work that you're doing as an oversight agency, but also what the law enforcement agency is doing that you've seen. Community involvement is kind of that other side of that. So where community outreach is mostly going out and talking to community involvement is bringing in the community and listening to what they have to say. It's really about getting input from your community and stakeholders. Number 12 is confidentiality, anonymity, and protection from retaliation. So stakeholders in the community must be confident that civilian oversight will protect sensitive information, as well as those who disclose it. So that's not only on the community side, that's also on the law enforcement side. So that is absolutely essential in the work of civilian oversight. And lastly, procedural justice and legitimacy. So research has shown that procedural just interaction between law enforcement and the community positively impact the community's perception of the police. And although the research is a much smaller body on the civilian oversight end of this, there's some research supporting the notion that procedurally just complaint processes, where complaints report being satisfied with the quality of communication in the process, increase complainant satisfaction, which means they feel that the process worked for them, and that's helping then, as a result, to build that bridge with the police officers and the law enforcement department in general. So with that, and I realize I have crammed a tremendous amount of information.
You're totally fine, but a quick question again. So
Yeah.
when you're talking about policy and pattern analysis, can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah.
What's the question about it?
Okay, so in policy and pattern analysis, so it's really looking at the law enforcement agency's policies. Well, there's actually two pieces to that. It's first looking at their policies as they exist. And sometimes that's looking at it because you've seen several complaints that have come in where the way that there could be a change in the policy that would benefit both law enforcement and the community. Pattern analysis is looking at, and Liana, I apologize, I'm going to use my favorite example that's actually yours. But pattern analysis is looking at things that are coming in, and if you're seeing a pattern, it allows you to help make changes. So the example that I steal from Liana in this case is that she was seeing these complaints come in, and they were very similar, and it was officers who were, I believe it was a chokehold actually, and chokeholds are out of policy in Tucson. But it was strange that they were all kind of coming in at once. And then she noticed that the only similarity between the different officers was that their badge numbers were somewhat consecutive, which means they were all in the same training class. So by looking at that pattern, she was able to go back and find out that all of that recruiting class was actually trained by someone, not the normal trainer, someone actually from another law enforcement agency where the chokehold was within policy. And so by finding that out, they were able to get that recruit class back in there, train them correctly, and then and never invite that trainer back again, and solve a problem before it got even worse. So that's more about the policy and pattern analysis, and that being able to have access to data so that you can do those things, and having the authority to actually make recommendations that then are responded to by law enforcement really makes for a more effective and civilian oversight agency.
Terrific, thank you. Okay, that answered the question that came up, so great, thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to turn it over to Liana then, and so that she can continue with civilian oversight structures.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the models, and I know the questions that I get every day, Camme kind of alluded to this ever since like the 1st of June. I've probably talked to at least 75 different communities across the country that want to create some kind of an oversight model. And the question I get asked most commonly is, which is the best model, or what are best practices? And NACOL, in the last couple of years or so, we've been transitioning away from using the term best practices to effective practices, because really, you know, the bottom line is you want what is effective for the needs of your community and what you're trying to accomplish in your community. So there's really 4 basic models that are recognized across the country, and who knows, you know, something else may come along, but these are the ones that actually have been around for a long time. And those are the review focus model, the monitor auditing focus model, the investigative model, and the hybrid models. And we'll talk about kind of the pros and cons of each type of model. So the review focus model is really one that ensures that the community has the ability to provide input into the complaint investigation. So these are really models that are more commonly like the review boards, where they are actually reviewing the work of the investigative agency. When I say investigative agency, it's usually the law enforcement agency, you know, their Office of Internal Affairs. It allows the community to because they're involved in reviewing those investigations, it increases public trust in the process because they know that someone outside of the police department, even though they are not conducting the investigations independently, they are still having access to the full investigation and what all the evidence that's contained in there. It's usually, as I said, an individual board or commission, and they're authorized to review completed internal investigations, and they most often have the ability to either agree or disagree with the findings. And when I say the findings, these are the findings that the internal affairs divisions are making with respect to the outcome, like either sustained or not sustained. In a review focused model, the entity has the ability to either agree or disagree most often with the findings. They most often they have the ability to receive civilian complaints and move them forward to the law enforcement agency for investigation, because again, they do not have the ability or authority rather to conduct their own investigations. Sometimes they have professional staff and or review or actual individuals that are assigned to the board to review those investigations and provide feedback to the law enforcement agencies. There's review boards sometimes that have like an executive director assigned to them. So the board itself has volunteer members on the board, but there is an actual staff in executive director or whatever the title. There's multiple titles for oftentimes, but they assist the board with performing their work and reviewing whatever files they choose to review. Again, as I said, they have the authority to remand the cases back to the department's internal affairs units for further investigation. And some of them have the ability to actually recommend case disposition, discipline, or revisions to departmental policies. I will say that recommending discipline and imposing different discipline are two different things. So most of the review focused models have the ability to recommend disposition. Most often it's not nothing that is, it's not an authority that they can actually impose discipline. They can also hear appeals from complainants and even sometimes subject officers. I know in some jurisdictions, if the complainant is dissatisfied with the outcome of their internal affairs investigation, regardless if the oversight model has chosen to review their complaint, they usually meet in a public setting, or where the actual member of the public that has the complaint can come before that board and request that their investigation be reviewed by that entity. And often, and sometimes, I mean, it's not unusual for officers to feel that they have not been treated fairly in the review process, in the investigative process as well. And some oversight entities do allow for the officers to bring forward their complaints of being treated unfairly. Holding public forums. This is kind of critical for these review focused models because they still want to be able to have their pulse, if you will, on the community and what some of the issues are out there in the community. So holding public forums is a very important component of how the review focused models are structured, those that are given that level of authority. And the community outreach, as Camme talked about under the 13 principles, the community outreach is essential to all of these models, but it's usually conducted by staff or review board members themselves. You need to be a little cautious about how you set it up, because sometimes if the board itself is seen or established as an actual committee of your local government, then sometimes conducting outreach by individual board members is not necessarily an issue. But if they're viewed as an extension of the public body, then you have to be cognizant of any kind of open meeting laws, which may come into play if the board or the actual board members are actually going out in groups that would constitute a quorum to do that public outreach. So you have to kind of make sure the wording in the language as far as giving them that authority is very specific to what they can and can't do with respect to the community outreach. Most of them do hold their meetings in public, again, in accordance with state law and union contracts. Usually these are volunteer boards or commissions. I like to say sometimes you can either overwhelm or underwhelm your volunteer boards. So you have to be careful sometimes as to how you structure it. Obviously in communities with large law enforcement agencies, I would doubt that this would be necessarily an issue in your community because of the number of officers you have. But obviously in larger cities, volunteer boards and commissions are pretty much overwhelmed sometimes with the number of cases that they would review. The individuals that you appoint to the boards or commissions are either entirely or partially appointed by the mayor and council. It depends on how your structure is set up, how your enabling ordinance is set up as far as who gets to appoint people to the boards. In some instances, they're allotted to have representatives from various community groups. I know some ordinances that I'm familiar with, they will require like a representative from maybe the ACLU or your local NAACP chapter, or pick one of your advocacy groups that is very active in your community. Sometimes there is a requirement that one of those representatives be appointed as a representation on the board. And in some cases, representatives from either the law enforcement agency or the union representing the officers can serve on these boards as voting members. That's very important because, or non-voting members rather, that's very important because oftentimes there is a need to have kind of like that subject matter expert kind of opinion on their board, but you don't want the board to be outvoted from existing law enforcement members when you're making recommendations and actions going forward. The city of Tucson saw that in the way that they redid their board. They used to have more active law enforcement members on the board than they had citizens, and the citizens were always kind of like outvoted on many of the policy recommendations moving forward. So they changed that in '97 when they revamped the structure of the board. And it's important to have that, there's that broad cross-section of community involvement because the various perspectives and forms of knowledge are should be included in the feedback to the department. I had a call earlier this morning with a council member actually from the Midwest, and we were talking about, who should be appointed, to these boards. And I told her, I said, one of the voices that's often always ignored is not ignored, but overlooked is somebody from, representing juveniles or, your younger population. I mean, everybody, most often we're thinking, homeless populations, persons with mental illness, working with those types of groups, that those voices be part of the board as well as, the various diversity of your community. But sometimes it's the youth voice is often overlooked. And again, just kind of repeating myself here, as oftentimes the volunteer review boards or commissions are assisted by professional staff who can kind of carry out the administrative and clerical functions. You'll need somebody to, provide them with the copies of the investigative reports or copies of information with respect to the evidence that's contained in the investigations themselves, so that they can do their jobs of thoroughly reviewing the completed investigations. Talk a little bit about some of the strengths and and challenges of this particular model. Obviously, it provides a high level of transparency because they're usually meeting mostly, almost all the time, 100% of the time in a public, as a public body. There's that level of involvement with the community because they're volunteer boards, and volunteer members are on that board, so they are very involved. And the police departments are more likely to take action on recommendations that are made publicly. So they're discussing cases and they're making recommendations in a public venue. And so it's that issue of transparency is, a key component, and it's something that's very well demonstrated with this type of a model. Some of the challenges are sometimes they lack the independence to be effective. So sometimes their level of authority can only go so far. And so that's kind of seen sometimes as not being an effective model. The all volunteer boards, can only review a limited number of cases. I know, just from personal, from personal experience in the city of Tucson, the auditor usually looks like 60 to 70 cases a month. But the board can only, they only meet once a month for a 2-hour time period. So they have to randomly select which cases they want to review. So sometimes they'll say, okay, we want to review 3 cases this month that maybe the allegation was use of force, or 3 cases this month that maybe the allegation was, rudeness or improper service. So they have to kind of sift through which complaints they will look at because again, like I said, you will very quickly overwhelm your volunteers if you give them, a huge number of cases each month to review. And there's that time commitment from the board members. I noticed in the last couple of years, or right before I retired, with the advent of body-worn cameras, they are such a critical piece, and I don't know if your community has them, but they are such a critical piece of the evidence that's looked at with respect to the complaint. And sometimes even if you have, let's say, 3 officers on the same call, you're looking at 3 officers body-worn camera that can take a long time to look at if you're really looking at closely, the commentary, the behaviors, the actions. So there is a huge time commitment, because not only are you looking at, the police reports and listening to the radio transmissions and the statements from the witnesses, the statements of the officers, but on top of that, if you're looking at body-worn camera video, that all adds to the time, effort that these volunteers need to put into it. And you have to really invest in the systemic training of your board members. It can be costly, it can be time consuming, especially when individual board members are kind of coming on and going off the board at different times. I mean, it's nice to get everybody trained up to the same level, but that doesn't necessarily happen because again, the changing people out at any given time, it's a challenge to keep everybody trained. And when I say trained, it's critical that your board understands even some of the basics, even how to read a police report with all the jargon and information that's in there. Sometimes that, that can be a challenge. How are officers dispatched to domestic violence calls? How are officers dispatched to, persons with mental illness? How are officers trained in de-escalation? So you want your board members to understand that. So when they're reading these cases, they're able to judge whether the officers are acting in accordance with training. So it's very important that the board gets the training as well. So
just quick question.
Go ahead. Yes, of course.
Would you prefer, so there were a couple of questions that came up in the Q&A. Would you rather have them at the end of the presentation because they're speaking specifically to your board, or would you like to answer them now?
I can answer them now. It'd probably be more consistent with.
Great. So there are 2 questions, and these are both from Paula Pillow. And the first one is, as to staffing, aside from administrative clerical support staff, do boards ever have paid investigative staff?
They do. Some boards do. I can think, and Camme, you can jump in if you can think of any. I know Atlanta has a board, and then they have an investigative staff and an executive officer that basically are servicing, if you want to call it servicing, but providing assistance to the board with respect to their review functions.
Yeah, there are a couple other examples as well. Miami is another one. And I will say that even specifically investigative focused models that Liana's getting ready to talk about, most of those have a civilian review board component to them that might have slightly different mandates than what we would see as a traditional review focused model board. But all of these have models have some kind of civilian review board, often kind of tacked on to them as well.
Thank you. And then the second question is, what kinds of trainings is recommended for board members? And you kind of cover, Liana kind of covered it, but maybe there's a little bit more specifics.
Well, I think, you know, at kind of a higher level is probably, when I say higher level, some of the more fundamental areas is, you know, state, you know, constitutional law, and, you know, do officers, when, you know, probable cause to even stop a car, you know, what is the actual, it's Graham v. Connor, basically it's, you know, it's a federal case with respect to, you know, the officers, you know, using probable cause, the search and seizure laws, the, you know, anything that you can think of from, you know, at that level of how officers are trained, you know, in constitutional, you know, policing. And then, you know, again, you know, their own internal training. And as I mentioned, you know, homelessness, domestic violence calls, you know, even basic traffic stops. How are they trained in, you know, approaching a vehicle, you know, on a high risk stop, so that, you know, the board members, you know, at least have that foundation to work off of when they're reviewing the complaints.
Terrific, thank you. And then there was a couple quick follow-up, which is who typically provides that training, and are there organizations that do the higher level training?
So usually that training is provided, you know, by obviously if it's training that the police department is providing their officers, you're going to want them to also provide that training to your board, because you want them to get the exact same training that, you know, it may be an abbreviated method of the training, but you want them to get the same training as the officers on a higher level. I mean, I know the city, we used to bring in, like, you know, the city attorney's office or the district attorney to talk more a little bit about the constitutional laws, and you know, that type of training. We've brought in like subject matter experts with respect to, you know, mental illness, persons in crisis, members of the community that, you know, work with those populations. We've brought them in to do training as well.
Terrific, thank you so much. Okay, we can continue on. No more questions at the moment.
No, that's okay. So the investigative focus model. So this is like, you know, the one everybody wants to have, I think, but then there are pros and cons to this one as well. So some of the, and these are pictures here of New York, the CCRB in New York. That's probably one of our biggest investigative model, if you will. So in New York City, all the investigations are completed by an outside of the police department. There is no internal affairs that are actually doing these investigations. These are all civilian-led investigations, and it's the Civilian Complaint Review Board in New York City. So some of the benefits of this model too, it's, you know, it may reduce the bias in investigation into the complaints because it's all civilians doing the investigations. There's full-time civilian investigators that may have to have specialized training, highly specialized training, really, to do investigations. You just, you know, you just have to have those trained investigators on staff to do these investigations. They don't, again, just repeating myself here again, but they don't rely on the investigations from within the department. They are conducting their own investigations, so it reduces that that appearance of potential bias by police basically investigating themselves. And it tends to increase the level of trust in the community in the investigative process, because they know that it's investigations being conducted, you know, outside of the department. I know earlier today I had a call from a reporter who's actually looking at the model in New York City, and they're talking about the subpoena power, and so there's challenges, even though this is probably looked at as the strongest model, the investigative model.
So there was one other question that came up, which is, and I'm kind of interrupting here.
No, that's okay.
But this is a little off topic. It's in mutual aid communities, who has oversight?
That's a good question. So I'm trying to think of some examples. I don't think we have that many oversight entities that have that, I mean, that structure that actually have oversight. I know that there's been conversations about it. I've actually talked to a couple of communities that are more so, they're wanting to do more of a county-wide oversight that takes in the police department as well. I guess maybe the closest I could think of that may fall into that category a little bit would be the Denver monitor, because he has oversight authority over not just the Denver Police Department, but also the county jails and the county sheriff's department. So there's a broader push right now for there being models that are more inclusive of, like the smaller communities out there. They're looking at more at a county level type of oversight. I did speak to a couple of individuals from Florida the other day, and they were talking about maybe 3 or 4 different small cities all in the same county working something out to create an oversight entity that would have authority over all 3 cities. But it's kind of unusual. I can't really say that there's definitely a model that we know really fits that definition right now.
Terrific, thank you.
So here again, the investigative model, they're employing professionally trained investigative staff. They're doing their own investigations. Basically, in some places, it can replace the critical functions of an internal affairs unit altogether if the oversight entity is looking at investigating both the citizen complaints and the internal complaints that are generated from within the departments that are often investigated by the oversight entity. Sometimes they only have jurisdiction, though, over certain types of investigations or allegations, rather. I think that especially in these larger communities and cities, in order to manage the caseload, sometimes they have to prioritize the types of complaints, such as they'll take all use of force allegations, racial profiling, maybe unlawful stops. And maybe they're not looking at kind of like the day-to-day, maybe rudeness and attitude types of complaints, only to be able to handle the sheer volume of the complaints that they get. They have the ability to conduct interviews of witnesses, including civilians and the police officers, gather their own evidence, they prepare investigative reports, and they can make recommendations or findings as to whether the evidence, supports the allegations in the complaint. So they're making a recommendation, and either, usually the common terms are sustained and not sustained findings with respect to the complaint. And in some cases, they can recommend and impose discipline. So we've had several agencies over the last couple of years who actually have gone back to voter initiatives to get a little bit more authority and the ability to make and recommend discipline. The most recent ones are probably, I would say, Oakland went back by a voter initiative to get that as part of their authority. And I think, is it Newark, Camme, that Newark, New Jersey may have that written into their level of authority as well.
I believe that's right. Mm-hmm. And then perhaps also Detroit may have that ability as well.
So next slide. So in addition to, that they have the investigative, that these models can have the professional staff, they can also have a board or commission kind of attached to them to be able to get that, that additional input from the communities that is so critical that we've, touched base on a couple of times here. The commission can act in an advisory capacity to the actual investigative model. Sometimes they can vote to initiate investigations. They can issue subpoenas, again, determine the disposition of misconduct allegations based on the staff investigation. So you can involve the board that is attached to it in multiple ways. Again, in partnership with the board or commission, they can hold the public hearings to conduct the outreach and look at policy related matters, and to make policy recommendations. I think it's important that, sometimes these investigative agencies, I mean, their whole focus sometimes is on these investigations because they're usually overwhelmed with the number of complaints that they have. And it's important to have that community outreach component or that board or commission attached to it to do the public hearings and to gather that information that's coming through that other avenue to help support when the investigative model or that particular agency is making recommendations for policy and procedural changes to the law enforcement agency or to the elected officials who basically have put them in place, put the structure in place. So some of the strengths and challenges of this type of a model, obviously it helps to rebuild the public trust because you have people completely outside of the police department doing the investigations. It avoids those conflicts and conflicts of interest that are sometimes inherent in internal affairs departments. I've witnessed this over the 20 years that I did this. Not everybody liked to be chosen to go on an assignment. When I say everybody, the law enforcement, it's usually sergeants and lieutenants, depending on how your structure is set up with your police department, but not everybody likes to be tasked with an assignment in internal affairs because they know that they will be investigating their own, people that, are their peers, and eventually they usually go back out into the field to work alongside of them. So I think from the law enforcement perspective, there is that inherent conflict of interest. And, the independent of police, this model is completely independent of internal affairs operations. The challenges are it obviously adds to the size and of the staff and the resources that you need to run these oversight agencies. So in New York City alone, I believe their CCRB has well over 100 staff and multiple layers of administrators, working on policies, making recommendations, working on findings, working on reports. So it is, it's very resource and obviously budgetarily intensive. The other challenge too is police departments are resistant to this type of oversight model because it's the one that has the most power to actually conduct the investigations outside of internal affairs. So there's usually a lot of challenges from police unions with respect to the authority that you're giving investigative models. Sometimes there is, because they are conducting their own investigations, these models oftentimes will have limited access to the internal records. So there has to be something really written in their enabling ordinances or jurisdictions that gives them the authority to have access to the radio transmissions, the body worn cameras, all that information that they would normally be reviewing in kind of a review and auditor model, have access to. In the case when they are doing the investigations, they have to have that they have to have that information to be able to do their work. And then again, in different states, just as Camme said, there's no two models are created exactly the same. Many models operating in states where there's very strong officers' Bill of Rights and, authorities, and the unions will challenge the level of authority of investigative models most often than not, because it's seen as probably one of the strongest models out there. I see you have questions. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So one is from Jan Schreiner, and she says, Camden, New Jersey Police Department has made some major changes. Do they have civilian oversight?
Not that we are aware of. I know that they've been in the news lately with respect to some of the changes that they've made. I don't believe they do, because I've actually gotten a couple of calls from individuals in the last couple of weeks there. If they did have oversight, it wasn't something that we were aware of, the model that they have, that's been in existence. But there is an increased kind of like interest in creating some kind of a model.
So just out of curiosity then, so the models that you're presenting, these are terms and structures that are recognized throughout the country, is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Great. Okay, then there's another question from Paula, and she says, is it mostly large jurisdictions that use the investigation-focused models?
Yes, for the most part, because those are the ones that usually have the financial means to to support those types of models.
Terrific. And that answers those questions. So onward we go. Thank you.
Okay. So the auditor monitor focus model, this is one that's kind of gotten a little more attention, probably in the last, maybe 5 to 10 years. It's kind of seen as a compromise of, not having a fully investigative model and only a review-based model, but one that has the ability to have more robust reporting practices than just, a monitor or basically a review board. Not as much necessarily as an investigative model. The auditors, monitors really work most often. I mean, they are reviewing completed, investigations, but they're also looking at more systemic issues to make recommendations for change. I always tell people, yes, it is about individual complaints. Obviously, we're not trying to diminish the importance of, each individual complaint should be reviewed and judged fairly and thoroughly. But in an auditor monitor focused model, you're really able to take the data that you have from looking at all these complaints and be able to make recommendations for change. So you're looking at systemic changes supported by what you're actually seeing in the complaints that you're reviewing. So they have the ability to, promote these long-term systemic changes. They're a lot less expensive than full investigative agencies, but obviously more expensive. The word expensive is all relevant, right? It's in Tucson we have an auditor model. We have, it's done with one auditor, one staff person that does that. Some of the other agencies that are kind of comparable in size to Tucson, I think New Orleans, San Jose, Austin, I mean, they have staffs of maybe 5 to 7 individuals with, police departments of upwards of, close to 1,000 officers, and they're performing the auditor monitor functions. They allow the agency to actively engage in many, if not all, of the aspects and the stages of the complaint process. So most of the monitors have written into their ordinances the ability to monitor, even though they don't have investigative authority, they can monitor an ongoing complaint. So they have the ability to say, maybe you have a complaint of a very high profile incident and your internal affairs division is actually conducting that investigation because the monitor doesn't have the ability to investigate, but they can actually sit in and observe the interviews of both the witnesses, the focus officers, and the witness officers, and be able to ask that their questions, when I say that the auditor or monitor, if they have particular questions to be asked of these individuals, they can pass those questions on through the internal affairs investigators that are conducting the investigations. So they do have a way to engage in the different aspects of the investigative process without doing the investigations themselves. And again, they're monitoring and reviewing, the policies, practices, and procedures, and making recommendations for, for changes in some places. In some respects, sometimes it's just, recommendations for changes in, how intake, how complaints are taken, or what is the follow-up to that internal affairs must do with complainants. We hear, a lot that, one of the biggest frustrations for community members sometimes is they file a complaint and then never hear the outcome. So the auditor can make, recommendations as to, the type of follow-through that is, required, it should be required. They're making certain that the complaint investigations are complying with established policies and procedures. Again, repeating myself here, but I tend to get ahead of my slides, but they're observing the interviews and asking questions. And actually, and to some extent, many times, overseeing the overall direction of the department's investigation, particularly when you're monitoring like high profile incidents. We've had our share, when I say we, the city of Tucson, of protests, not just recently, but years past. And, you know, how wide or how broad the department is going to expand on, you know, the officers of the actions and, you know, of the actions of the officers and the strategies that they use to monitor or engage in those particular protests that you know, resulted in complaints being filed. The monitor can sometimes, so what they're looking for is, you know, the fairness and consistency of how the complaints are being, you know, if you will, kind of like the outcome and the findings of the complaint, to make sure that there are also within disciplinary protocols, so that if the discipline is being administered fairly for the same type of infraction. And sometimes you see that often, that in different chains of command in larger structures, when I say larger structures, larger law enforcement agency, you know, an infraction with a similar type of characteristics can deem to be less or more severe depending on who the supervisor is that's meting out the discipline. So you're also looking for fairness and consistency in how the discipline is being handed out. They can do complaint intake, they can do complaint classification, and again, making recommendations regarding a lot of different aspects of the law enforcement agency and not just the complaint process. And then there's also that community engagement component. I know that many of the auditors have advisory boards to them as well, so that they have the ability to bring in or appoint like task forces for certain projects or issues that they want to get input from the community on. So the auditor monitor model is, if you looked at, you know, all of them across the country, there's probably more differences in these models than in anything else. And again, that's determined by the community that establishes these entities and what level of authority you really want to give that position with respect to what are your community outcomes. What do you want to see accomplished with creating that particular model. Usually it's staffed by professionals with backgrounds in, you know, social sciences, auditing, data analysis, because you're looking at a lot of data. You're looking at, you know, persons who have experience in doing the community outreach, because it takes a certain individual, certain personalities to be able to kind of recognize, you know, what communities really need the outreach, but what method of outreach they need. For some particular communities, you know, put it on the website and that's all they need. Some communities, actually, you need to go out and actually engage with them. When I'm saying communities, you know, members of the communities, recognizing the diversity in your community. Are you providing your information in different language formats? You know, when we started this, we talked about, you know, interpreters and all those different ways that you can communicate with a community are critical to this type of a structure. You have to have the ability to look at the complaints with respect to, you know, the training, the staffing, the recruitment. They look at use of force, crime prevention strategies. They have broad access to the department records and information. They can look at the overall complaint process, again, to ensure that's fair and thorough. They can also both audit, and I mentioned this before, internally generated complaints and complaints generated from the community. So there's usually law enforcement agencies kind of distinguish the complaints that are generated from the community are looked upon as external complaints, and those are the ones that usually the oversight entity, regardless of the structure, has access to. But then there's also complaints that are generated internally in the department when either someone in the department reports something that they may have witnessed, or it comes to the attention in another manner other than a community member filing a complaint, and it is investigated. So those are where there's a lot more, probably more reason to be able to substantiate a complaint, and probably more of the serious allegations are coming, when I'm not saying probably, but a lot more of the serious allegations are coming from the internally generated complaints. And not very many oversight entities actually have the authority to look at the internally generated complaints. Auditor monitors can conduct interviews of select aspects of the operation of departments, like what are they doing to prevent complaints. Litigation, Camme talked about this a little bit in kind of the effective principles, the 13 practices, as far as, are you looking at litigation data to see, you know, what is your city being sued for with respect to how your officers are acting. Somebody said, you know, gosh, one payout on behalf of the city could have funded, you know, an oversight entity, you know, for a year or two. Not to say again that the oversight is the be all end all, but if you could have prevented something from happening, you're in a better position to be servicing your city and the needs. There's also those robust reporting requirements. Most of the auditors and monitors put out annual or biannual reports. If you want to look at some there in California, I think San Jose is one of the ones that does a really good job of their reports. I think they're still doing biannual reporting. Denver also puts out semi-annual and annual reports, and then they also put out reports with respect to individual like issues that they're looking. They just a couple of, well, it's probably about a year now, did a report on issues within I mentioned they have oversight over the jails as well, and so they did a major report on that too. But they do have very robust reporting requirements, most of them. Strengths, just kind of very quickly, obviously identifying issues on how complaints are handled from start to finish. If there's any kind of impediments to the complaint process or access to the complaints, that can be identified, you know, upfront, because the auditor monitor are actually seeing that complaint process and reviewing it. They can identify systemic issues with training and policies and supervision. Like Camme used the example on the training of the chokeholds. That is one that we tell often, because I mean, that was something just from being able to look at, you know, systemic or actually, you know, like patterns and practices. They can assess the effectiveness of early warning systems. Many law enforcement agencies have those warning systems, in that, you know, if an officer has X number of complaints in a set period of time, it'll trigger an early warning system flag that, you know, somebody needs to be paying more attention, maybe at a supervisor level, to the actions of the officer, and maybe there's retraining, or there's maybe something going on in that officer's life that is bringing out those complaints. And the ability to garner public trust. I think when we started this section, we talked about it's kind of a compromise from having a fully investigative body versus at least having, you know, having that level of authority to make a lot of these recommendations, and based on patterns, trends, and, you know, involvement with the community. I think it goes a long way to engage the community and garner their trust. Again, the challenges here are actually, you know, that you're still relying on, because you're not doing your own investigations, you're relying on the law enforcement agency to provide you with the accurate information to conduct your review of the complaints, the thoroughness and fairness of the complaints. Sometimes, you know, being able to identify patterns and trends requires more extensive data analysis and collection, and a lot of these agencies don't necessarily have that kind of staffing. Many of them do, but obviously you can't make a recommendation for something based on one complaint. You know, you have to have the data to support it. And sometimes the data that you're using may be flawed, because there's either underreporting of, you know, marginalized groups. I had a police chief one time tell me, so the complaints are down this month. Does that mean that my officers are doing a really good job, or does that mean that people don't trust the complaint process? So I'd like to think it's probably a little bit of both. And so if you're using, you know, data from complaints to support, you know, recommendations, sometimes that can be a challenge because you don't really know if you're getting all the complaints or the level of satisfaction. That's why many of these monitors and auditors actually also use surveys, community surveys as satisfaction surveys for complainants as part of their process. And then just really quickly, so there's the hybrid models. They're usually contain elements from one or more of the models. They've been, you know, developed to address the needs of specific community and maybe in some respects to conform to state laws that, you know, maybe you have to have, or you can't have an investigative model, but maybe you can have a combination of the auditor, and it's very common to have a combination of the auditor and maybe a community volunteer board. We see a lot that sometimes they're because these come about because there's changes made to an existing agency. Many of our agencies, we didn't say this up front, but not all of the oversight agencies across the country are members of NACO, so we don't know how every one of them obviously operates, but many of them have been in existence for over 40, some are at like 45 years in existence across the country. So throughout their history, they have sometimes kind of gone back and redesigned the work that they do and the level of authority that they are given. So the hybrid models are becoming increasingly common now. Just, you know, some of the other functions that the hybrid models can have, you know, they're usually reviewing the completed investigations. Some cities actually have multiple agencies performing distinct functions of the oversight. Seattle, for example, has 3 different levels of oversight. They actually have a community board that has their charge within their ordinance. They also have their internal affairs unit, if you will. It's physically housed within the police department, but it's overseen by civilians, a civilian director who basically has the equivalent standing of a police captain, but it's overseen, and he or she, I think it's still he, has investigators sworn in law enforcement that are part of the internal affairs working for him, but the director is actually a civilian. And then recently, as a result of their federal consent decree, they've also implemented, I think maybe going on a little over 2 years now, they have an inspector general's office that is actually monitoring the work of internal affairs to make sure that they are complying with all the requirements of the federal consent decree that they are just coming out of. So there are some cities that have multiple oversight structures. And then again, professional staff, you know, receive input and feedback from boards or commissions that represent the community, and they can also, you know, evaluate the oversight entity or the entities in place. Many of the boards, actually, part of their charge is to sometimes give like a performance or an evaluation, if you will, of the, you know, the auditor or the monitor. I know in Denver, the monitor is required to have an evaluation by the actual board that's attached to it. The monitor in New Orleans, who is our president, the NACO president, she is actually not overseen, but evaluated every 3 years as to her work. Even though her model is as a monitor, there is feedback from an outside entity to review her work. And so there's different ways that you can set up the structure with respect to how you're evaluating the effectiveness of the model. And I think, do we have more questions?
Well, we do have questions, but before we jump into them, or we'll open it up for questions, I don't see any specific Q&As or anybody in the chat, but I just want to thank you both for a phenomenal presentation. There's so much rich information. Thank you. Before I don't know, I don't see any questions yet, but I will also ask though that if people would like to join NACOL, can you talk a little bit about becoming a member and what that's about? Because we'd love to hear it.
So we have 4 different actual membership categories, actually 5 different membership categories. We have organizational memberships, and those are usually for like the cities or entities that are have created an oversight structure with an organizational membership. They're allowed to list as many people on their board or commission or on their staff as they want as members. So we count, say you have a board of 7 individuals, they all fall under the umbrella of the organizational membership. The next level is regular memberships status, and I should say the cost of becoming a member are pretty minimal based on the information that we provide, and Camme and I aren't stingy about sharing information regardless of whether you're a member or not. We provide the information, but we have the regular category, and those are usually individuals that are working in the field of oversight. Some of those are actually like on monitoring teams. Some of them are actual employees of the oversight agencies who just want to be able to have maintain their regular membership, because then it gives them voting rights, because we are established by a set of bylaws. So we elect our president and our vice president and all of our board members on a rotational kind of a staggered basis every other year. And then we have associate members, and that's usually the category where current law enforcement we also have a requirement on our bylaws that we can't have, we don't allow current law enforcement to be on as a voting member of our organization. And so those are our associate member categories, but we have also students and academics that are part of the association category. And we have a student category, and we also have lifetime members, individuals who have been in oversight for a long time, and our founding members. I should give a plug for our founding members. A lot of people don't realize that the organization itself was founded by former law enforcement members that had actually left the profession of law enforcement to do oversight and recognize the need of building those bridges between the communities and the law enforcement agencies.
Wow, okay. So if people want more information about your work, they can go to nacole.org, and that's NACOLE.org, correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. And then also, before we got on, you, or maybe it was Camme, who mentioned that you will be also doing another training, sort of like this 101, Civilian Oversight 101. Do you want to share that information with us?
Sure. So on Wednesday evening, we'll be doing, well, I guess afternoon and evening for you, we'll be doing 2 more Civilian Oversight 101s. They'll look somewhat similar to this, but if you have people in your community who weren't able to join this and would like information, or you'd like more information and more opportunities to interact with people who are interested in oversight, that'll take place Wednesday, and we have one at 3 p.m. and one at 5 p.m. your time. And registration for that, it's a free event, and registration is on our website as well. I think there's a link that on our homepage under recent announcements that'll take you to the registration.
Okay, that's fantastic. And just so we will be sending a copy of this recording to everybody who is registered for a call, because there were a number of people who were wanting to be here but couldn't. And we'll also be sending out the PDF that is on your site, which I will just quickly share so you know what I'm talking about, because I think you've got a lot of very good information there. So where are we? Do you see that?
The infographic,
The infographic. So for this is available also on your website, but we will be sending that out along with your website and further information for people who want more information. And then we're going to continue this conversation on July 8th at 6 p.m. our time, and really then look with you both and our police chief, Tina Nieto, to see what would work for our city. And I'm not sure if we'll be able to have our city manager on or other council members, but we'll see where we go on this. But this has been incredibly, incredibly helpful. Before we sign off on anything, I'm just going to see, is there anybody else that has any other questions or comments? You can either raise your hand in the participant box or type something in the chat or in the Q&A. Okay, awesome. And Karen Arahu says, thank you very much to Marina Democrats. Informative and helpful. Wonderful. You are so welcome. Paula Pillow has her hand up, so we'll go back to her for a second. This has just been, I just, before we, well, I'll keep my comments in a minute. Okay. You've been so great. Okay. Peter Williams, if people typing thank you in the Q&A. Paula, were you going to say something?
Yes, I just wanted to encourage everybody to come to this next meeting. Hopefully it'll be, a working meeting. We had our chief give us this great presentation last week, and this was fabulous. It's food for thought, and hopefully it'll generate some more ideas and questions, and we can have a good outcome. But we really need to stay on this and work on this together. Thank you.
Right. Okay, there are a couple of questions. This is from, I don't know if it's Arlene or Alan Hoffa, and they say, thank you, this was great. One thing it might be nice to talk about next time is the future. If communities move toward the proposed Minneapolis model of departments of community safety and violence prevention, then how do you see the roles of oversight boards changing? Would it be most necessary when being developed? So maybe we can take a couple minutes and answer some of that.
Go ahead, Liana.
Actually, that's a question that I've been asked a lot in the last couple of days. I mean, I don't see that the role of oversight is necessarily going to go away. I mean, it may change a little bit in that respect. I don't think we actually see exactly the fullest extent of how it will change, but there still will be that need for that accountability and transparency piece, as part in the role that, oversight does play in some of these communities.
Add anything else before there's another comment that says the panelists were so generous and thorough in their presentation. Thank you. Yes. I see no more comments, no more chat. So before I turn this over to David, I'm just going to thank you so much. This was so much rich information, so much to think about, and really gave us great context. Oh, hold on. There's one. Okay. So, okay, we do have two more questions, and then I'm going to wrap it up because Greg says, have you seen the thin blue line role of some unions change in the communities with oversight? It's a good question.
So I will say that there are some communities that have had, for lack of a better term, issues with unions from the get-go, and it has been a nonstop battle. An excellent example of that is the city of Miami. But I do think that there are some cities where the union has come over time to see the oversight entity as a legitimate agency. But it has taken time. I know that there are lots of cities who operate without the union trying to cut them off at every pass. I know that Liana and I are from two cities where that is the case. There definitely are occasionally some butting of heads, but for the most part, an understanding of the jobs that that both are trying to do. So I do see that through working and being fair and transparent and holding the oversight agency to a level of accountability, that it has built up that legitimacy, not only with the law enforcement of the community, but also that third entity, the police union.
Mhm, mhm. Thank you for that. And then lastly, will you be able to share your PowerPoint with us, and we can share them on our website? Because it's really, we want to be sure that on our next meeting that it really is a rich conversation with people who are knowledgeable and have done the research, so we can really have a good conversation about what's best for Marina.
Yes,
So
we can definitely send those along to you to send out with the rest of the resources. And then there are a couple other resources, particularly on the model types. Some reports that have been done by us in the past that may be of use in providing even more information prior to that conversation.
that would be fantastic. And then, is there anything aside from reading that and being sure that people are up to date on, hopefully have gone to your website and really looked at it and paid attention here, is there anything else that you think we should do so that we can come to our meeting on July 8th prepared?
Liana, do you want to, I feel like having that information, either listening to the recording, looking at the materials again, I think that will be good. Liana, do you have any other suggestions outside of that realm?
Other than something that you may have actually already done is conducted some, in the circles that you are involved in your community, gotten other input, from members of the community in your conversation as to what, because ultimately it needs to be, all stakeholders need to be considered. So I know, your group has taken on the charge to, be able to make the recommendations, but to the extent possible that you can get input from other stakeholders in the community, that may be helpful to, to the conversation, because when Camme and I go into a community, we don't necessarily know everything about them. And it's interesting when we start talking to, different groups, it's like, oh, we left out, this important piece of something that happened that, that maybe we need to address with whatever model we, make recommendations for. But
It's actually really helpful. Okay.
I was going to just add, that also includes those who may be opposed to moving forward with oversight.
Right. And I think too that, for our city, because we are small and we are on a very tight budget, especially in light of COVID, you mentioned the multi-city possibility, or like working on the county level. So that's something that might be good for us as well, and something that we may want to discuss about a little bit more. And so we'll definitely be sending this conversation, the recording of this conversation, on to some of our other cities. And in fact, I actually know that there are a number of people on this call from other cities that are curious to know more. So that's actually exciting. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just saying that's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
All right. Well, I think that's it. Thank you. You all have just been phenomenal, and thank you for your time, especially because I know you're a little bit later than we are. So,
well, thank you for having us. It's wonderful to get this information out, and we really appreciate those of you who've joined today, and for you for inviting us to learn more about it as you move forward, to have as much information. That means a lot to us in the work that we do to see that happening. So thank you for having us today.
For sure, absolutely. You've definitely shown us, because it's been in our conversation for a while, and there's a lot of thought that really needs to go into this. So thank you again, and we'll see you on the 8th. Okay. David, is there anything you wanted to say in signing off?
Well, I just wanted to thank the participants tonight. I wanted to thank Camme McEllhiney and Liana Perez for their fantastic presentations. We've gotten a lot of substantive information and a lot of food for thought. The city of Marina is a small community, and I think perhaps the general sentiment may be that we don't have a policing problem, but I think also we do have a problem in reaching out to those underrepresented, underreported communities. So before we give ourselves a pat on the back and a clean slate, I think we need to redouble our efforts to reach out to our community and make sure that they really are living in a great city. But once again, Lisa, thank you for your moderation on this. It's been wonderful. Thank you to the participants, and thank you to all the folks viewing tonight. As Lisa indicated, we'll be making this recording available on our website for you. So thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
thank you. We'll also be sending it out to everyone who is registered as well. So, okay, thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. Thank you. Have a nice time.
You too.
Good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.